All too often the circumstances and players in a murder are all too obvious, but sometimes much less so. True cases are generally less convoluted than those thought up by authors and screenwriters. But every so often you come across a true crime case that has more twists and turns than a slinky made of corkscrews. The murder of Judy Southern in South Carolina in 2000 was one such case where it appeared that when all became clear, the cockwomble responsible had some extremely reprehensible earlier behaviour. So here is a trigger warning for abuse against an infant. This is the case of the murder of Judy Southern and the disgusting perpetrator behind it. And this is Murderer's Row. If I was to say the word Gaffney to any Brit of a certain age, they would probably think of this fella. But in today's case, it refers to a small city in South Carolina where Gaffney is the nearest urban area to the site of a murder that occurred in the year 2000. And our story begins with a man called Alan Southern returning to his quite isolated home on the peculiarly named Cowpens Pacolet Highway on the 7th of June. And when he came home that day, he found his wife Judy collapsed on the lawn. She claimed an intruder had been in their home and fired at her, and she'd been hit in her lower right side. He called 911 and the operator asked if he knew who'd wounded her, and the husband screamed back that he had no clue. He said that Judy mumbled something about a person named Barry, but that he didn't know anyone called Barry.
Bleeding from her, sir. She's been shot. Who shot her? I do not have a clue. When I got there, there's a bullet wound in her right lower abdomen. Does she know who shot her? She gave me a name of somebody, Barry. He was waiting for her in the house.
Investigators didn't know it yet, but they were going to uncover a motive for this crime that was so senseless and disgusting that it would probably haunt them for the rest of their careers. Judy Southern was returning home as normal from a long day of work to what she thought was an empty house. But she was wrong. Inside the house she was ambushed by an unknown man armed with a gun, who immediately shot at her, and she was hit in the right side as she scrambled out of the house and collapsed on the lawn. Holding pressure on her wound, she used her mobile phone to call her husband's work, but he had already left for the day and was in the process of driving home. When the shocked man got to his ailing wife, he asked what had happened, and this is when she told him that there had been an intruder in the home with a firearm and that she'd been hit. And Alan could see that she was in a very bad way and carried her to the car while dialing 911. But unfortunately, by the time the Southerns got to the hospital, Judy was beyond help and finally succumbed to her wounds. Judy had passed away before her twin sister Trudy could say goodbye to her. And of course the entire family was completely devastated by the loss. It was clear how much she was loved and how much of a shock this news had come to the family. The investigators wanted to know if Judy had any enemies or was involved with any dangerous individuals, and the family could not think of a single person that may want to do this to Judy. Police turned to the crime scene to examine any evidence that the intruder may have left behind, and thankfully they found a significant trail of clues. Despite Alan claiming an unknown intruder had attacked his wife, there was no evidence of forced entry into the house. But there were other indications of someone having been at the home. The phone lines were found to have been cut, and all of the knives in the home had been hidden. This unknown person had also spent quite a bit of time in the house, as in every single room of the house, and DNA revealed he'd even taken a shower, played a kid's video game, and used an adult toy on himself while he waited in the empty home. As you do. Cigarette butts throughout the house were collected for evidence, along with the shell casings from a 9mm firearm that were found in the hallway of the home. Most significant of all was a handwritten note that was discovered lying next to Judy in the yard, and in scraggly, scrapey writing it read, "This is for my wife Melanie. I love you. Sorry it had to end like this. I leave everything that I have to my loving, caring wife." This note was signed by someone named Jonathan, but the last name was very scrawled and difficult to decipher, and while it was a virtual confession of sorts, the only identifying features on the note were the names Melanie and Jonathan, or so it appeared at first. With the scene being a fluid, changing thing as time went on, while information was being gathered, probability still suggested the involvement of Judy's husband, Alan. On the 911 call, Alan said Judy mumbled her attacker might have been someone named Barry, and that intrigued the investigators. But what did this bizarre note have to do with the crime that had taken place? Was the note placed there as a red herring to deliberately lead police away from the truth? Because the note actually sounded more like someone threatening to take their own life, not somebody else's. So why would that someone want Judy Southern dead? Now, aside from this cryptic note, the early investigation had discovered that Alan Southern had a potential motive for wanting Judy gone. The authorities, like in most of these cases, were focusing in on the husband as the initial suspect. But Alan Southern vehemently denied any involvement. Judy's twin sister Trudy said that Judy and Alan had had ongoing marriage troubles for many years, that they were both having affairs, and that they slept in separate bedrooms of the house. And she claimed that the couple had only stayed together for the sake of their 5-year-old son, agreeing that divorce would be too hard on the child. So a loveless marriage, but if both sides were used to infidelities, why would Alan want Judy out of the picture? Other people the police spoke to claimed that Judy had said to them that if something were ever to happen to her, that Alan most likely had something to do with it. And then something shocking was found at the crime scene. There was a recording device hidden in the Southerns' home phone. That can't be good. Trudy said that her sister believed that Alan may have been secretly recording her phone calls. So they hatched a plan to maybe test this out. And the twins started fabricating stories to see if any of them would make their way back to them. And when Alan brought up something regarding one of these false stories, they knew they had been right, as the nature of this lie was only ever mentioned in their phone calls. Detectives confirmed that at the time of this break-in, Alan had 2 previous affairs under his belt, and that Judy was currently in an affair herself. And Trudy had also said that 2 days before she was attacked, that Judy had confided in her that she and Alan were officially separating. Judy was allegedly afraid for her life, saying that things had become increasingly hostile, and the two had gotten into a huge fight. So now there was a motive that the authorities could work with. If Judy was gone, Alan would gain sole custody of their son, as well as, cha-ching, Judy's hefty life insurance policy. Now, what were the chances of an insurance policy? The mind boggles. But things were far from cut and dry. Alan had no history of violence. He didn't own a 9mm gun, and he passed a polygraph test. Besides, his alibi of being at work and driving home at the exact time of the crime had checked out. So the investigators then wondered if he may have hired somebody to do it, so that he could have a solid alibi. And the investigators at this point turned back to the weird note that they had found. and they originally believed that the signature at the bottom said Jonathan Barry, since Judy had mentioned something about the name Barry when Alan first found her. The note had been written to my wife Melanie, but at the top, in really small writing, police noticed a mailing address under the name Melanie Binney. So the police now had a potential surname, and so they decided to try to find any local Binneys. To this end, they looked through marriage records until they found Melanie Binney, who had a 26-year-old husband by the name of Jonathan. And this was not just a good fit in terms of the names, but also geographically, since the Binneys lived only 3 miles down the road from the Southerns. Now, this geographical convenience, coupled with the fact that Alan claimed never to have met the Binneys and didn't know a Jonathan or a Melanie, led them to thinking that perhaps Alan had got Jonathan to kill his wife. So, determined to prove Alan was lying, the detectives got to work looking through phone records and emails to see if the two men had ever been in contact with each other. They could not find a single shred of evidence that the two men had ever potentially spoken or crossed paths with each other. So it was finally time to consider that Alan could be telling the truth. So at this point, police turned their attention to Jonathan Binney. And what they found was horrifying, so be warned. They discovered that Jonathan was out on bond after previously being arrested for molesting his own 3-month-old daughter. In the note they'd found, the writer mentioned taking his own life because the thought of going to prison for what he did to his own child was too much for him. But with this new piece of information, suddenly the note was beginning to make some kind of sense. But why would it be at the site of a murder seemingly unconnected to the Binneys? To confirm that Jonathan had written the note, they sent it to a document analysis expert along with a sample of Jonathan Binney's known handwriting. And with his open lowercase g's and f's that tilted away from the rest of his words, the expert could prove with absolute certainty that the writing was identical. It also helped that the fingerprints on the note belonged to Jonathan as well. But they still didn't know why this note was found next to a mortally wounded woman several miles down the road. And for now, Binney himself could not be located. A manhunt began, which included helicopters using thermal imaging from the sky. And the next morning, authorities went back to the Binney home to see if he had returned there. They were in luck and found him lying shirtless in a sleeping bag in his basement, with 4 nicotine patches on his chest. He told the police he was attempting to OD with the patches. Really, Binney? Really, 4 nicotine patches. As they led him up the stairs in handcuffs, he mumbled something under his breath that one of the officers actually heard. And this was Jonathan quietly asking, "She's dead, isn't she?" And the officer asked, "Who?" with Jonathan responding, "The woman I shot." But of course, once they got him into the interrogation room and shit started getting real, he took back this confession and asked for an attorney. So they booked him into jail while continuing to build their case against him. The cigarette butts collected at the scene were confirmed to be a match for Jonathan's DNA. And the discarded 9mm pistol was finally found in a field between the Binnies' home and the Southern home. A firearm examiner compared the shell casings from the crime scene with the weapon, and he had no doubt that this was the gun that had been used in the shooting. The motive may have been unclear, but the evidence was unquestionable. So with all the evidence pointing to Binny, they needed to figure out what the motive was. Now, admittedly, they didn't need it legally to make a case, but it would make a more compelling case for a jury if they could find a motive. But the only thing they could find that the two people seemed to have in common was that both Jonathan and Judy had a public library card for the same library. But after sitting for a few nights in county jail, Binny had already decided he was ready to talk and was willing to do so without an attorney present. Right away when they got there, he told them he wanted capital punishment, and that was what he deserved for his crimes. And next he told them in words and later in a 5-page confession letter exactly what he did that day and why. Now, you remember the unspeakable crime against his daughter that he'd been arrested for. It appeared that this arrest had become the motive for why he decided to end the life of Judy Southern. Despite being out on bond, Jonathan's attorney had warned him that if he was found guilty of the crime against his daughter, he would most likely spend a minimum of 10 years in prison, and fucking rightly so, the dirty bastard. You don't have to be a hardened criminal to know that there's definitely a hierarchy where inmates in prisons rank in relation to their crimes. And even amongst the worst offenders, it's an unspoken rule that child predators are the lowest of the low. And Jonathan knew that people like him didn't fare well in prison. So he decided he was going to turn up in prison not as a child abuser, but as a stone-cold murderer instead. He confirmed that he didn't know the Southerns, and also that Alan had nothing to do with the crime. He said he had chosen the Southern home at random while he was driving around and entered the house through an unlocked window. He snuck around the house, playing with sex toys apparently, cut the phone lines, and waited for whoever would be the first person to arrive home. While waiting, as I suggested, he made himself lunch, went through the family's personal stuff, and took a shower. They believed that Judy had come home around 3:30, but Jonathan didn't initially hear her enter the house. And she didn't realize anything was wrong until she walked into the kitchen and found the strange note that Jonathan had written to his wife lying on the counter. The two surprised each other when Jonathan came out of the bathroom, and Judy grabbed the note and made a break for it. But as she was fleeing, Jonathan fired 2 rounds at her. The first one missed, but the second struck her in the abdomen. As Judy collapsed on the lawn, Jonathan fled on his moped, as you know a hardened murderer would, leaving Alan to find Judy only a few minutes later. Jonathan Binney was sentenced for the crimes against Judy Southern, as well as his 3-month-old daughter, the poor fucking blighter, and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. But this story doesn't end with a cockwomble being sentenced to death. Since raping his daughter and murdering a woman with the intent to be executed, he had a change of heart and is now a trans woman called Taylor Alex Cross. And she's won a reprieve from the death penalty through a written contract signed by multiple parties. Binney/Cross agreed to never again appeal the 2002 murder conviction or punishment if sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Binney/Cross also agreed never to seek parole, even if state law later changed. Reflecting that Binney/Cross identifies as transgender, and given what was a legal name change, defense attorneys used ink pens to correct the typed legal contract between the state of South Carolina and Taylor Alex Cross, aka Jonathan Kyle Binney, to change all references of he to she, because heaven forbid that a vile shitwaffle be given the wrong pronouns in the legal papers. Fuck me, I am so enraged by all of this. But I guess at least she can't hurt anyone else. Whatever her faults, Judy Southern did not deserve to die, and indeed to die for such a flimsy and pathetic reason is then ever more galling. It must have been hard for Alan Southern to have been looked at so intensively, but I hope he understands why that was necessary in pursuing justice for Judy. I send love and condolences to all of those affected by Judy's death, and of course affected by this asshole's other abhorrent crime. This video is dedicated to Judy Southern. Thank you for watching another episode of Murder of Crows. Please consider subscribing if you haven't yet, in order to be notified of the twice weekly episodes that I'm releasing. With that said, I'm Steve. This apathetic lump is Samson. And we will see you when we see you.
Say